Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Yankee Cowboy Podcast. I'm joined by the co-host, Chris, joining me once again. This topic's probably a special one for both of us because we're both NASCAR fans. But we were talking offline, and I thought it was a hell of a topic to conversate about. Is that in the most recent days after the SHR controversy of closing down, we're having a conversation here about is the money being spent correctly in NASCAR? The charter agreement overall has not been good. The conversation that you hear between NASCAR and the charter. So is it really worth the money to be in NASCAR? That's the conversation, Chris, I think. I mean, we go back and forth. We're longtime NASCAR fans. I think the two of us can say that. And the reason why this conversation even started, really, it started with the Stewart-Haas closing down at the end of the year. That news broke, but the one thing that I think we both kind of were like we understood was someone just bought a charter for $40 million this past offseason. And right now, Stewart-Haas is about to sell theirs individually 3 charters. I think it's 3 or 4 now, Chris.
4.
4? Is it a 4-team op or a 3-team op?
It's a 4-team operation.
Yeah, so they're trying to sell theirs for $25 million a piece. And yes, is there going to be suitors for that? Sure. But then the next piece of this puzzle, Chris, came out, and this is why we have this episode. You know, Ryan McGee from ESPN, who, if you not listened to Marty and McGee ever on ESPN, you have lived in a cave for most of your adult life. They're phenomenal 2 journalists. I will call them that because that's actually what they are. Unlike most of the blowhards that you listen to on sports media, Marty and McGee, Ryan McGee, did a news article yesterday that got posted on ESPN. And this recording's on June 12th. And it really stated a lot that NASCAR and the charter agreement stated. I think, Chris, you said it best in that we were talking, is that we cannot fund you unless we're being funded. Is that the exact quote?
Yeah. To paraphrase something that Ryan McGee reported, that Jim France has basically told all the NASCAR team owners, essentially, we can't offer permanent charters because, end quote, we only can support you as long as we're being supported. And, with that being the obviously media networks who are paying the rights fees to broadcast NASCAR.
So here's the underwhelming really question of I ask, and this is really it's a conversation here, and it's, would you, as a team owner, think it is right for someone to pay only $25 million? Okay, we're talking about millions, and not to use the Trump lingo, but millions and billions and billions and billions, but $1 million for a charter that on a long storied history of a franchise, which is Stewart-Haas. Now, Gene Haas, Tony Stewart, obviously went into business for themselves. What, late 2000s, Chris? I think it was 2009 or 8.
2009 is when the team existed. So it was, Gene
Haas. It was Haas Automation, right? It was the main.
Yep.
It was Gene Haas's team for the most part, and then I think Tony
bought into it
in 2009. So that for that team to kind of do its thing, obviously, okay. Then you bring over Kevin Harvick. We could talk about the history, which I did in the other episode. But when you bring over really pedigree drivers and you bring over pedigree sponsors, you got Eric Almirola bringing over arguably probably one of the biggest corporations when it comes to food sponsorship with Smithfield. You got Miller, I think Miller Coors, right? Or Anheuser-Busch. Sorry, I don't mean to mix those up. I apologize for all the true beer drinkers of the world, because they are 2 different companies. Even though they both taste exactly the same. But you get those major corporations sponsoring the team, and then they're your funding's taken care of, right? So that's what we can kind of go there. But before we kind of go into this conversation, a charter, by the way, there's a history behind the whole charter system. I think, Chris, you might have a better idea about it than I do, but I thought it's the legacy teams. You have like Penske, you have Richard Childress, Hendrick, Joe Gibbs. Those are all legacy teams, right? And they can own up. They have up to 4 teams. There's a restriction on how many cars you used to be able to own. So that changed probably, I think, late late 2000s, I think it
Yeah.
changed.
So give a little short, I know we've talked about in previous episodes, you might have talked about in the solo
Yep.
episode you did. Give people a quick idea. So basically, the charter system started in 2016. Prior to that, there really was no tangible value to a race team. Now, outside of obviously the real estate they own, the equipment they own, anything ancillary to that is all that the teams were basically own, and then obviously allocated out of that was sponsorship and merchandise, and a small cut that they would get from essentially prize money or tow money that they'd get from NASCAR. So as the years went along and owners came in and owners came out of the sport, you had owner drivers, you had just folks, really so much of the revenue that teams were bringing in, talks has been is it's over 80% of the revenue that a team brings in is just solely on sponsorship. When you look at other models like in the NFL or other sports where sponsorship is just a very small percentage of what the overall revenue is, when you look at things like the television, the television package and revenue sharing and things like that. So the idea was to create a marketplace similar to a franchise model, and so all the major team owners all were incorporated into the charter system, and really the first charter that was sold, I think, was in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 million, and over the last several, really almost decade, the price, as we talked about last year with the Spire charter that was purchased from Live Fast Racing, going for a reported $40 million. That's kind of where the charter systems, really kind of started. And now, there's kind of been this, not, I wouldn't say lull, but now there's this kind of flood the market, that it's a supply versus demand thing. It's like owning a home. If you have lesser of a supply of it, obviously the cost is going to shoot up. But now that there's the supply seems to be going up, and maybe the demand is sort of there, but it's not there. No one's knocking down doors now that has changed. That now these with these 4 charters available, it's now kind of driving down those costs for a charter.
Well, let me just ask this question, because this is kind of in my view, really an important one. Is, let's say that operation at Stewart Haas Racing team was only 2 cars. Would that drive the cost up to $35 million? Because there's 2 teams less, or two numbers less to be offered. Like it seems like it. So the Spire Motorsports ever recovered the $15 million that they overpaid, and in essence they overpaid for.
No, I mean, unless they sell that charter for 40
$50 million or 60
over,
or,
unless they sell anything,
profit,
then no, you're gonna lose money on that charter. So but then obviously there's so much of the charter system that we as fans don't know, because it's all written in, like we don't, NASCAR doesn't disclose what the prize money is anymore. It used to be, you could go back a decade plus.
It used to be posted every race.
Yep. Now we do know at the beginning of a weekend what the posted prize money is, so we say it's $7 million, $8 million, so on and so forth, but we don't know how that breakdown is actually done. All that is kind of done in secrecy between NASCAR, the RTA, and the teams itself. So, for us, we kind of fly blind compared to other sports where, you could pull up and see how much money, how much cap space or how much revenue or how much, all that stuff is publicly known. But in NASCAR, it's very much, keep the cards close to your chest type deal.
Yeah, and I will say this: there's a history of the charter deal that's kind of, in my view, I get it. I mean, it's a supply demand system, but so in 2018, Furniture Row, who I think they almost came off a year running the championship.
It literally was exactly a year. Yeah.
Yeah, they sold their charter to Spire for only $6 million, and then 3 years later, Denny Hamlin and Michael Jordan founded 2311 Racing. And after they bought the Starcom Racing charter for $21 million. So to me, it seems like okay, what exactly are you buying for that money? Are you buying the number, the rights to that number, the history behind that number? What in essence are you buying with that? Because you're not buying engines. You're not buying engines, because those are usually supplied by the manufacturer or some kind of alliance that you have. Either Chevy and Ford, and they all have different alliances with engine departments and stuff like that. Especially now, this new
It
car.
really has nothing to do from a competition standpoint. Strictly, I mean, this essentially you're buying something that is intangible. I mean, it's on a piece of paper, but essentially it's like you're buying a non-tangible, non-fungible, what I don't know what that, whatever, use all the different whatever it is, but essentially you're buying something that is supposed to provide value to being a team owner in the NASCAR Cup Series. Now there are certain parameters, like you have to attempt all the races to hold on to that charter. You can't. NASCAR also, under this agreement, holds essentially a performance clause in there that if you finished at the bottom of the chartered teams so many consecutive years, NASCAR is granted the right to revoke that charter. So essentially, so you can't,
You can't be able to park and drive and park basically.
You can't essentially tank and just we're just going to collect,
because that's another thing
money.
we were seeing with the teams that were selling off. And of course, we talk about some of these teams. If you're a long time history of the fan of the industry and the sport, some of these teams that sold to newer teams, or for example, Starcom, the old BK Racing, Drive Fast, a lot of these teams that came off of other teams that unfortunately went under, or went out of business and sold their equipment and their affiliations and things like that. So it just kind of seems weird to me that, and this is where I think legitimately a conversation is made, because in November, Chris, NASCAR announced a 7-year four network TV deal for $7.7 billion. That's billion with a B. So the lingo in that Ryan McGee article says that we cannot fund you unless we're being funded. It's very empty and very like hollow words, because if you look at the percentage of the ownership deal now, like we talk about how it's sliced up, it's almost like like you were telling me off air, it's like a 75-25 in favor of NASCAR.
Yeah, but NASCAR owns the vast majority of the racetracks. There's the tracks that are owned by the the SMI, Smith family, and then you obviously have the independent track of Pocono, and then Indianapolis Motor Speedway owned by Penske Corporation. So the reality of it is that you can't.
The reason why I bring this conversation, which by the way, Ryan McGee, I'm going to stand corrected here. Ryan McGee in the article that's on ESPN gets the exact percentages down, but it's essentially close to being, plus or it's borderline 75-25. It's probably within 10 percentage points off from what I said here. They're saying that they're currently receiving 39% of the television revenue. Tracks get 51%, and NASCAR gets 10%. So if you combine NASCAR and the tracks percentage, it's 61%. But as an owner, Chris, the difference is right now, is even worthwhile going racing at this point? Is it really? I mean, unless you have some money to spend year over year as tax write-off, it's not competitive. And that's why I see why SHR, Gene Haas, which we can go through the history of that.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry, cut you off there. I mean, I think that the Stewart Haas story, yes, they're kind of interconnected there, but I mean, the reality of it is that unless you obviously ask them, I mean, the reality of it is that Gene Haas was becoming increasingly more disillusioned by being in NASCAR. I think he is enjoying the spoils of when he jumped into Formula One. I mean, I think he jumped in at when the buying was low, and now it's really, really high. Tony Stewart, there, make no bones about it, he's been very disillusioned with NASCAR. I think there's a few things that he can look back on between. Obviously I think there's been a couple things that have got frustrated him with NASCAR. I think
been reported too.
Yeah, I mean, Ford not Ford basically blocking him by signing Kyle Larson, I think was a major turnoff to him. I think Ford as a whole, I feel like they've definitely moved. I think the uncompetitiveness of Stewart-Haas racing the last couple of years. I think them kind of being knocked down a tier in the Ford camp. And now, and obviously he's a full-time drag racer now in the NHRA
Yeah,
racing in
exactly.
Top
Yeah. I
Fuel.
mean, that's
So
and that's the thing too. Things got reported between even his relationship with NASCAR. I mean, obviously he owns Eldora,
yep,
and there was
Eldora, yep.
rumors there was rumors about them getting a date on the Cup level. That didn't come to fruition. The truck, I think the truck race got pulled off the schedule.
Yep.
And got put at the Bristol, So there was a lot of, I would say, if Tony Stewart's Tony Stewart, I don't think there's the man can drive a race car. I don't think anyone can argue that. But is his passions there in the NASCAR ownership world? I think it was first, 10 or so years, but after the pandemic, it probably change things. I'm not saying that his personal relationship in getting married changed any of that. I just think that he has different ambitions now. And also, I'm not sure the financial side of the NHRA stuff, but it seems to me like it's more profitable and more economical to be running on a drag, running a NHRA car compared to a NASCAR team.
Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, I think Tony's in a position over there where he gets a lot of money from maybe say Dodge or Stellantis or whoever owns Dodge at this point.
Yeah.
To essentially he's factory funded. So I mean they're basically paying him to run this team. So it's kind of a
It's a good
blank
economical
checkbook.
venture then at that point.
Yeah, I mean he's getting
because in the words of a lot of NASCAR fans, and this is also in the Ryan McGee article, is that NASCAR teams say that sponsorship money and covers about 80% of their budget year over year.
Mhm.
So with that being said,
I mean, you lose a major sponsor. I mean, that could be doors closing. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Yeah, and that's where you're right about that. That's where it's legitimate, and I don't. How do I put it to you, man? Like I don't. It's something unique, and I don't mean that in a crazy negative sense here, but at the same time, how do I put it this to understanding is like if you're a NASCAR team, let's just say you're just coming into the sport and you're starting a team, not including the charter spend, you need probably about $40 to $50 million to operate the team, give or take, or is it now the cost significantly less now because of this cup package?
I mean, I've heard and listened to other podcasts. I mean, I've heard that the teams are actually spending more money, now because these cars are vastly more expensive to compete with because everything is, you're buying stuff. You're not making anything. Everything is, you're basically working with suppliers, and suppliers have to
OEM stuff.
Yeah, chassis and different parts and pieces and components, and everything is single sourced, and you're dealing with inflation and stuff like that. So it's no, and in a lot of ways, I've heard teams are actually spending more money. It's kind of like government says, oh, if you spend more money up front, then in the long run you save money. That's never been true. So the teams are actually, from what everyone's saying, they're spending more money now because of how expensive a lot of these parts and pieces are. I mean, I've read that the underbodies that these cars run now are $30,000 to $40,000 a piece. And these are basically they're essentially carbon fiber pieces that have to be run on these cars, and yeah, they're expensive. So the transaxle and the all the suspension components, the drive line, everything is vastly more expensive than when you had non-single sourced pieces. So now teams are really spending a lot more money.
And I legitimately, I always appreciate these conversations as a whole because they're always unique in the sense where at the end of the day, a team like, let's just give you an example, a team like 2311 or even Spire Motorsports that has furthered their spend in the sport, what made them invest money into NASCAR? Like, I'm always intrigued by these newer teams that you, like, for example, Trackhouse or or Colleague Racing. These guys invest money into the sport. What are they seeing as an ROI? And they're not seeing an ROI. They're
No,
spending a boatload of cash.
I mean, I don't. I mean, I think Jeff Gordon has said in interviews as well. I mean, Rick Hendrick hasn't made money in decades. I mean, you probably go back 2+ decades. I mean, there was a time when you could make money. But if
Well,
you
back
want to
when the sport was a lot of big money sponsors were in the sport, man.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously things were, nothing is, what you paid for something in the 1990s is compared to now you paid vastly more for something compared to what you were paying for something back then. But
Of course.
yeah, I mean, the revenue, the amount of, the cost to compete and I mean, engineering, technology,
Well,
everything that goes into
I don't
building these race
disagree. I don't
cars.
disagree that things go up in price. I don't think me and you we can go back and forth on that. Things do go up in price, but I'm saying is, where do these guys offset that cost, though, man? Like, it's where are these guys?
That,
Where is their philanthropy or their business model? Think that going into racing is a
I
economical
mean,
good return of investment. Like, yes, Rick Hendrick owns a boatload of car dealerships across
yeah,
North Carolina. There's no question.
yeah.
Trackhouse, okay, I don't know his business venture. I know that Spire Motorsports, I don't know their business ventures, but those guys are untapped commodities in the sport of ownership. You know who Michael Jordan is.
Yeah.
We all do. I think universally, if you don't know who Michael Jordan is, you lived under a rock for 30 years. Uh, Denny
I mean,
Hamlin, we know who he is for the most part.
I think owners get into racing for different reasons. I mean, yeah, when you look at the guys like Rick Hendrick and Roger Penske. I mean, obviously, they have these vast businesses. Rick obviously in the automotive industry. Roger with dealerships and truck rental and stuff like that. I mean, you look at let's use Penske as an example. I mean, they've got a long association with Shell Pennzoil. I mean, if that again, I'm just throwing out rounded numbers, but say if Shell Pennzoil spends $30 to $40 million a year with Roger Penske, well, having access to all of his dealerships and the whole Penske, network, and that's 400 to 500 billion dollars worth of $1 million worth of business that is being brought back. So I mean, for them to sponsor his race cars for $30 million, $30 or $40 million a year, that's a kick in the bucket for
Well, then why
Valvoline and
don't
all.
they do that on the cup level or on the any kind of level? I know they do it in like IndyCar and
No, I mean
like
I mean I would assume that's again that's just I would say that's
just
across the board. What
yeah,
what I'm saying
yeah. Go ahead.
oh, yeah, what I'm saying is that you look at owners get into racing for different reasons. I mean, Rick Hendrick and Roger Penske probably say this is their golf game for them. A guy like for Richard Childress, I mean, this is his lifeblood. I mean, he probably skims money off the top of it, and that's what he lives on, and the rest goes into the race team. A guy like Justin Marks, I think he's got a very entrepreneurial mindset. I mean, he's a former driver, but I think he looks at it from a business standpoint. He's got other ventures outside of just the race team. He's trying to grow this. I think it's called like Trackhouse Entertainment Group. So it's not just, hey, we're an entertainment company, but we also have a race team. Now we have got the MotoGP team. I would there's Matt Colleague. He's kind of similar. He's got an entrepreneurial background. But yeah, Denny Hamlin, Michael Jordan. I mean, every owner in the sport, I think, has different reasons for why they want to be involved. But I think when it comes down to it, the biggest thing they want to do is like, hey, I'm putting money into this thing. I want to at least get something out of it. And I don't want to keep droning on here, but you look back and we've alluded to this Ryan
Well,
McGee article.
yeah,
He talks about in there was the saddest day he ever saw was when Ricky Rudd had to liquidate his entire team in 1999 before he went to go drive for Robert Yates Racing. So you figure Ricky Rudd had been a team owner for, I believe, about 6 or 7 years, won the Brickyard 400, and he's basically selling all of his parts and pieces for pennies on the dollar.
yeah.
After investing tens of millions of dollars into it.
And that's where, I mean, legitimately, man, like I wonder myself going in, because it obviously the cup level, the dollars are higher, they're more expensive, but you have teams on the lower levels, okay, Xfinity truck series, even on the local level, modifieds, dirt track teams that legitimately have extremely high spends every year, year over year. Going racing is not something that is cheap by any imagination. And it's daunting to me if they're going to go like, so this is where this conversation really stems is, can the teams get an extra 20% or 15%? I know we're tackling like percentage numbers, but those percentage numbers can keep a business afloat year over year. And does it change it really, in my opinion, where this argument needs to be stemmed is NASCAR needs to stop being restrictive on acquiring of sponsorships and what they classify as worthy enough to be on a race car. I'm not talking about OnlyFans and okay, they stop allowing sponsorships of tobacco. I get that stuff. Okay, I think we can all agree with that. I'm talking about, for example, you stop allowing. I think it was there's not a Bitcoin or some kind of cryptocurrency companies that wanted to sponsor some of these newer drivers, and they got kicked the can down the street and said no, it can't do it. Or political, God forbid, you let a political aspiration go sponsor a race car, and that's because that's their own choice. But some of these teams, there's been a big pushback, or I would say exit from the sport on these big corporations. NASCAR needs to kind of find a more, I think, open-ended, an open-minded situation here on acquiring and allowing sponsors to come into the sport, not just on the speedway side, but like also on the cars. Like you want these teams to be around, but yet maybe they don't. I don't know, Chris. I mean, I don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, again, the ability to acquire sponsorship is getting harder and harder because obviously, again, costs continue to rise to compete, but the amount of dollars that's being thrown around is just less and less. I mean, yeah, we've seen major, Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 250 companies exit motorsports, which has definitely hurt it. But again, I mean, you got to look at it from the perspective of, I mean, you read in if you go look at Twitter or X or any of these, and there's talk about we start talking about this charter stuff, and a lot of fans are like, we just need to go back to the fastest 43 cars. Like, we don't need these charters. And I get it. NASCAR fans, a lot of times live in the past and what they remember the days of 45 and 50 teams showing up. But the reality of it is that it's a different sport now. And
Is there necessarily anything wrong with 40? Let's say I don't think there's been a full field. I think it was what, 42 cars. I think the longest I've seen as Daytona 500. Is there anything wrong with just taking every team that they, you got to quality into the field? Like, is there anything wrong with that?
I mean, I,
Then you get the drive and park situation again.
No, yeah, I mean, you get that. I mean, the challenge of it is that the model has changed. I mean, the model hasn't changed. I guess I should say it's team. You have to, like, when, again, alluding to that Ricky, part of the Ricky Rudd story. I mean, how many more of these team owners, do we see come in and spend all this money and want to get involved in the sport, and then within 5, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years they're out of the sport. I mean, it's you have to create an avenue to keep owners in the sport. And the reality of it is that you look at guys like Roger Penske's 87, Rick Hendricks in his 70s, Jack Roush is in his 80s, Joe Gibbs is in his 80s. I mean, and there's not. I mean, yeah, now we're starting to slowly see some new owners come in. I mean, you see Brad Keselowski's involved. You see Denny Hamlin involved. Jimmy Johnson over there at Legacy Motor Club. But the reality of it is that we don't have guys like a Jeff Bezos. We don't see an Elon Musk. We don't see some of these guys who have real FU money to get involved in racing. But then you look at here in Charlotte, the Carolina Panthers, when they were purchased, they sold for $2.5 billion. It's very hard to ask somebody who wants to get involved in motorsports to say, hey, you spend all this money and you're going to get basically nothing out of it. That's very hard for a successful businessman to do, is to spend all this money and essentially say, yeah, you're gonna be involved. You might win a bunch of races, you might win a championship, but then after that, your team's gonna go up for auction. You're gonna have a bunch of ARCA and Xfinity and truck people come and just buy everything you spent millions of dollars on for pennies on the dollar. That's not a sustainable model.
Yeah, and that's where I think legitimately, man, like I was talking about this, is NASCAR does need to reform the really the level of how do you go about getting sponsors? How do you get more eyes on the sport that's productive? Because even on the, not the Formula One, but the IndyCar side too as well, and even the IMSA, you're seeing more teams that you may not have heard of before get invest into the company or the ownership group and put their name on a car, even though they know that they don't have as many eyes on the product. Because if you look at those motorsports in comparison to NASCAR, IMSA, IndyCar, which IndyCar is now rumored to have a media rights deal in the foregone conclusion here with Fox, and it's going to be announced probably sooner rather than later. You're going to have more eyeballs at that point because you're going on to live TV, streaming, things like that. I just think it's overall NASCAR has a money problem, and it's never going to get better. I think it's just more of a greedy thing now. It's the chart. I think it's better to qualify, and if you get in there, you get in there. If you don't, you don't. Like
last thing, and I don't want to make it longer than it needs to be, but I think one of the things we have to look at, and I agree with Denny Hamlin on this. I agree with Denny Hamlin on this, and he had talked about, the reality is, and this should be more intriguing towards race fans. All the talk has been, especially down in the lower series, like, oh, you just got these rich kids come in and take rides away from drivers who really deserve it. The reality of it is that, if you can get that revenue split more favorable towards the race teams, where, hey, maybe their costs are covered and they don't have to rely so much on sponsorship, you can get the top tier drivers in cars where it's not like, okay, you can really drive. You've come up through you've come up out of short tracks into the ARCA series, into the trucks, through the Xfinity series, but you got to bring like $5, $10, $15 million to drive. If teams don't have to rely on sponsorship as much, and they can basically start out, neutral, and everything on top of that is more revenue, you can have better drivers. And I think we all would agree we'd love to have better, more accomplished drivers. Not saying that there aren't in the Cup Series, but if you want the top tier drivers,
and younger, definitely getting younger and younger.
But yeah, it'll be interesting how this plays out here. I think over the next, we got basically till November. Yeah,
we'll probably know by season end what the deal is. But man, I appreciate you joining me for this one. It's been a fun weekend. I know last week we were both traveling and seeing the world, but I hope everyone has a great weekend. Appreciate it as always, Chris, joining me. We got another episode we're going to bring up and talk about here shortly. It's the great news that Dan Hurley's sticking around the Yukon. Hell yeah. That's the next episode. I hope everyone listens. I appreciate all the listenership, all the time, all the fun. Have a good weekend. Take it easy. Keep it smooth. All right.